In chapter 4, you are going to continue your exploration of the market system, and you will discover what happens when supply and demand change. And you will also begin to explore what happens when there are what are known as market failures. So if you'll remember from chapter 3, we discussed the law of supply and the law of demand. We were very specific in what those laws were, and we were very clear on what sorts of influences had to happen in order for the supply function to shift or for the demand function to shift. So please make sure that you're very clear on the difference between moving along a demand and supply curve and shifting the demand and supply curve. In chapter 4, we will examine what happens when we have a supply and demand, and we recognize that while we may be at an equilibrium and the market clears, life happens and something changes. And so we will begin to explore what happens when something changes. So for example, if you've ever been a traveler, especially before February 2020, you might have noticed that airline tickets often are more expensive during the summer months. Why do you suppose that is? Well, we might want to ask that question and then try to answer that question, but there's all kinds of things that are going on in the background. So in order to develop this model, we use a phrase, an assumption called ceteris paribus. And ceteris paribus essentially means we're going to hold everything else constant. So in this case, all we're going to examine is a change in the season. We're not going to examine changes in the daily weather. We're not going to examine changes in the price of admission to Disney World. We're just going to examine what happens when we go from spring to summer and what happens in the market for airline travel. So in this chapter, you'll begin to explore these questions and be able to model what happens. So for example, you might look at, well, what happens if supply of a product increases? How does that change the equilibrium? You might look at what happens if supply decreases and demand also decreases. How does that affect our equilibrium? You could say what happens when they both increase. There's lots of different combinations of changes to the market system. So you're going to explore what happens to the market when we have something that changes supply and or demand. And I will tell you, one of the easiest hints is to get used to just drawing a quick sketch and model that increase or decrease and then observe what happens. We're also going to discuss some market interventions in this chapter. In particular, we'll look at price ceilings. Those are laws set in place to make sure that prices don't rise too much. And price floors, those are laws put in place to make sure that the price doesn't fall too much. And each of those laws are set in place to help either the producer or the consumer. So you'll explore what happens when we intervene in the market system, when we don't like the equilibrium and we want to try to do something about that. We'll also examine several different market failures. We'll look at the market failure having to do with lack of competition. How does that influence the market when there's not a great deal of competition? We'll look at the market failure of externalities. What happens in the market when there is a negative externality or possibly a positive externality? But the textbook and most economists typically focus on negative externalities. We'll examine briefly the idea of what are known as public goods and what happens in the market when the good that we're talking about fits certain characteristics that define it as a public good. And we'll also look at the market failure that has to do with the lack of inequality. So, or the lack of income equality. You'll notice in chapter 4, we just introduced these ideas, income inequality, public goods, externalities, lack of competition. And then later in the semester, we'll examine them in much more detail. So during this chapter, you'll explore what happens in the market system, what happens when we don't like what the result is, and what happens when there's really a failure of the market system.